Hi everyone, Bishop Keith again, and I hope you're enjoying this reflection in Holy Week. I'm certainly enjoying reading and reflecting and preparing these talks, and so I hope they're of great encouragement to you. I want to say thank you to everybody who has been encouraging me by various messages and comments. Thank you so much for those comments and messages. They really do encourage me, and so please keep them up if you can. I'm really enjoying it. Today, I want to reflect on Tuesday and Holy Week about the teachings of Jesus in his last days, and specifically about the great commandment: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. In these teachings, Jesus does this in the temple precinct in the court of the Gentiles. And back to our theme of risk, these teachings were of great importance, but they were also highly risky. Jesus risked arrest. Even though no such event occurred, he was free to conduct his teachings, but he was very, very at risk of being arrested, and the authorities were certainly keeping a close eye on him after his cleansing of the temple earlier. So as we think about this theme of risk, whenever teaching occurs, sermons are preached, including mine, I have to say, there is a risk that the teacher or the preacher will be misunderstood, either deliberately or mistakenly. Jesus' courage in his teachings are extraordinary. But not only does he risk misunderstanding, as I've said before, he risks arrest. Now, there is quite a bit of teaching by Jesus in this time in the temple, and so what I want to do is encourage you to go back to the Gospels and to reread them and to reflect and ponder the various teachings that Jesus concentrates on during this time. I want to start though I want to just concentrate on the teaching of the Great Commandment. Mark chapter 12 verses 28 to 34 covers this teaching. Jesus is replying to a question about what is the greatest commandment. He replies, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength." He goes on to say, the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. The question of the greatest commandment was a perennial one. There were 613 commandments in the Hebrew scriptures. I have no idea how they managed to keep up with them all. No wonder they always got into trouble. Professor Levine explains that in the rabbinic tradition, these 613 commands were divided into two: 365 negative commands, such as "you shall not kill." These correspond to the number of days in a solar year, 365. She goes on to then note that the 248 that are left, they are positive commands. For example, honor your father and mother. These examples equate in the rabbinic tradition to the number of parts in the human body. Over time, due to the transition from a wandering desert community to a settled domestic community, these commandments had to be supplemented. This is where the Pharisees came in and helped to transition the people in keeping the law properly in their new circumstances, either as settled in Israel, or under foreign rule, or in the diaspora when the nation was scattered throughout the world. We are familiar with laws changing, aren't we? Both in the secular world and, of course, in our church world. For example, who can be ordained has now changed for many in our churches. We also need to understand which are the more important ones to keep and which are no longer relevant. King David summarized the law into 11 commands. Isaiah summarized the law into 6 commands. The prophet Micah, which is the last book of the Hebrew scriptures, comes up with what is known as the Micah Code. What does the Lord your God require of you? To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. What a great way to sum up the law. The rub here is only walking humbly with God can we do justice and love kindness. When either of these two are absent from our churches, then we are not walking humbly with our God. Professor Levine notes that it is impossible to keep these laws perfectly. Indeed, that was the critique of Jesus often. The question of the scribe is not so much to trap Jesus, as happened earlier when the scribes and the Pharisees tried to trap Jesus into asking about paying taxes to Caesar. The scribe is simply trying to discuss how this young rabbi, who was clearly on the right track, can help him live rightly, and by inference, how this beautiful Jesus can help us to live rightly. Jesus' response, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," is familiar. It's from Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 4 to 5. These verses are part of Judaism's daily liturgy. Professor Levine notes one element in this that I was not aware of, and I wonder if you've noted it as well. Go back and have a look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 4 to 5. And it's why we should familiar ourselves with the Hebrew scriptures. And that is the reference to all your mind is not in Deuteronomy. I wasn't aware of that. Jesus adds to it. She notes this is perfectly Jewish. Jesus adding with all your mind is a perfectly natural Jewish thing to do. You take a command and you add to it to assist the people following that command appropriately. She notes that this is part of the Jewish practice of building a fence around the law to help it being followed by its followers more appropriately. Jesus then follows this up with, a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's a really tough one, isn't it? This is not from Deuteronomy, but from Leviticus. Specifically, Leviticus 19, verse 18. The scribe responds, well done. These two commandments are much more important than all the burnt offerings and all the sacrifice that we do in the temple each and every day. When we move from the first of these, and it's a great encouragement to Jesus and to the disciples to hear such affirmation as it is for us. When we move from the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to the fourth Gospel, John, we see a slightly different take on this. In chapter 13, verse 34, Jesus says, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Because the commandment to love is not new, the reference to as I have loved you is the new part of the commandment. Jesus shows his love for us by willingly sacrificing his life for us. Are we willing to do the same for others? More specifically, for those who we do not like. Jesus is not asking us to do anything that he is not willing to do himself. This is the great challenge of Jesus. When we talk about loving God and loving neighbour, what do we mean by that? I love you, and so I will accept your invitation to dinner, or I will water your plants while you're on holiday. However, what about I love you, and so I will give my life for you? That's a bit tougher, isn't it? So when we stop and simply reflect on these different summations of the commandments, we find one common theme. The summation of the command comes to be in right relationship with one another and with God. We are not to concentrate so much on specific do's and don'ts, but how we relate to one another, how we care for one another, how we have compassion for one another, how we love one another. We are to relate to one another in love. This is the message of Holy Week, love. When we think back on our theme of my reflections during this week about risk, really, what greater risk can we take than to love another person, especially someone whom we do not like or do not know. Yet, whatever love we might have for God or one another, or for another person, it is God's love for us that is even stronger, and Jesus is the model for us. Jesus demonstrates this love of God being more powerful than anything else, even when it seems that he is doubting God's love for him. Do you remember when he is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he asks for the cup to pass from him? He is showing that he can truly be honest with God, and that we can be honest with God in whatever situation we are and whatever is on our hearts or minds, no matter how painful or how disastrous we might be, a disastrous situation we might be, we can have confidence in God and God's love for us. In the supposed cry of the dereliction on the cross, do you remember that? Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is taken from Psalm 22. It's not quoted, but Jesus knows the psalm continues thus: "For he did not despise or abhor the affliction of the afflicted. He did not hide his face from me, but heard when I cried to him." The honest cry, the deep feeling of abandonment, is not the end of the story. It's not the end of the good news. Thus, the great commandment to love God and to love our neighbour as ourselves is at the heart an encouragement to risk greatly, to fully open ourselves to God and to one another, and to allow the love of God to take us places that we are not necessarily comfortable in going and experiencing, that which we might naturally seek to avoid. The story of Holy Week tells us that when we allow God to take us to these places of risk, despite discomfort, despite the horrors, despite the uncomfortableness of it, the rewards are transformative for us and for the world that we are a part of. The Lord be with you.